In this lesson we're going to look at building interest in our house track. Now, a common feature of house seems to be these string pads. Now, what you've essentially got here is just a small section of strings, and rather than having an orchestration of kind of chords and complexity, it really seems to be built around one note, and that's the root note. So for my particular piece, I'm working in E minor. I've got it here somewhere, here it is, in E minor. So all I've done is pulled out the E note and then doubled it up, and that's going to run all the way through this kind of second development. And I really am only going to do that in one section, just to kind of have a little bit more tension to the part. I've also put just a little bit in the intro as well, just to kind of build up. Now, the interesting thing about the strings is the way they modulate. Now, the modulation for my ones is going to be via volume modulation, and I'm going to have it pulsing on the beat with the chords, so that basically every time it hits a chord, the padded string gets slightly louder, and this is going to give it this nice little accent. Now, how I've done this down here is basically come to the pen tool, and I've just kind of drawn them in. If you've got a MIDI controller and you can actually just play it in with the MIDI controller, that's obviously better, but for this purpose I've just drawn it in. I've given it a fade, and I've also faded it out at the end, but it is one continuous note. The problem with working with one continuous note in MIDI is every single time you want to hear the adjustments that you've made, you do have to play it from the absolute beginning, okay? Now, I've also done some extra stuff to my keyboard part, and I'll show you that in just a second, but for now let's just solo this string pad. And it's really simple. So I've just taken the key note, made it into an octave spread, put this little bit of modulation on in terms of the volume controller here, and that's pretty much it. So here it is, here's how it sounds on its own. Now, this string sound that I'm using is quite a thin sound. Ideally, you want to go for as thick a texture as you possibly can. In Logic, you've got a nice one called pop strings that you use, but for my particular purposes, I'm just going for this thin texture, this string ensemble, and it's okay, it'll work. But for yours, you may want to think about just choosing a more thicker texture, just so you kind of just get this big sustained section and make it really push through. So, how I've enhanced this particular track is with the piano part. So coming back to the piano part, I haven't changed any of the notes from last lesson, but what I've done is I've added some automation. So let me just close the piano roll up, and let me bring up the automation panel. Okay, so here's my automation. I've done two sets of automation here. I've used a bypass. So if I bring up the EQ, I've used a bypass to actually turn the automation completely off and on after it gets past the point that I actually want it, so it doesn't affect anything else. And then I've just adjusted the cutoff of this high pass filter, okay? And basically all I'm doing is moving it up and down. Once again, I started off by just using the pencil tool, so coming up here and using the pencil tool and kind of drawing my shapes in. And then when I wanted it more specific, I just zoomed in, and then I just used the arrow tool just to kind of get rid of all the messiness and then shape it out a little bit. Now this is really interesting. If I start by just playing you the piano and the strings together, you'll kind of get an idea for what I was going for. Okay, so you can hear that's quite interesting. You do need to know about automation. You've probably already got this because you would use quite a bit of automation when you was doing your task 1A and your 1B. But remember, if you're using automation and you're writing it in live, you do need to come down to the right button and make it right. Now, the problem with this, of course, every time you loop over it, it will change this, okay? So do remember to take it back to read once you've finished all of your automation. Otherwise, you will start losing stuff as you kind of touch dials and things like that. It's a fairly simple lesson, so I'm not going to go on any longer than I have to for this, but one thing I do want to show you is how I've referenced this. Now, I've referenced it in 2 tracks. I've referenced it in my David Guetta Lovers on the Sun towards the end of the track, and I've also referenced it on Duke Dumont. Now, the Duke Dumont is very much using some of these automation techniques that I wanted to get in. So there's some good notes for your logbook. Before we move on and I just play this whole track, I'm just going to play you an excerpt from both of those songs just so you can hear how this sustained pad or sustained string works, okay? Now here it is in David Guetta's Lovers on the Sun.
Let's light it up until our hearts catch fire.
And you can just hear it there. It's ever so low in the mix, so don't feel that you have to bring the strings right up. It is adding that padded texture. Now here it is in I Got You. Hopefully I've got it in the right place.
As I got you, baby. As long as I got you.
And you can just kind of hear it pulsing ever so slightly, and that's towards the end of both of those tracks, and they are very, very subtle, but it does add that extra bit of depth to the mix. Now, before I let you crack on and add your own strings into yours, let me just play you how mine is sounding so far. So let's get rid of some of this automation and let's have a listen. So as you can hear, that's pretty cool, and it works so successfully. It might need to be turned down ever so slightly, but I'm happy with where it is at the moment, and I particularly like the way it built up the break and the middle section. So that's pretty much it from me. Get your strings in, and I'll meet you in the next lesson.